Over the past week, more than 2,000 people reported the same phenomenon. Strange dreams, sudden impulses, a kind of calling. Not a voice, not a vision, just an internal pull that appeared without warning. People who never spoke to each other, describing the same sensation, using almost the same words. But that leads to the question no one knows how to answer yet. A calling from what? From the outside, nothing seems different. Life continues, schedules hold, conversations sound normal, but inside something feels slightly misaligned, as if an inner rhythm has changed. You may wake up with a sense of urgency that has no clear cause, or feel drawn toward choices you had already decided to postpone. It's subtle enough to doubt, yet persistent enough to ignore. This calling doesn't ask for belief, it doesn't demand attention, it simply waits to be noticed. And once you notice it, even for a second, it becomes harder to pretend you didn't. Something invisible has shifted, not in the world but in how you meet it. When the emerald signal awakens, nothing dramatic happens on the outside. No flash, no voice, no event you can point to and say, that was it. What shifts is quieter and far more destabilizing. It begins as a subtle rearrangement inside you, like furniture being moved in a dark room while you're still trying to sleep. You wake up sensing that something is different, but you can't immediately explain what changed. The signal is not information. It doesn't arrive as a message you can analyze. It arrives as a frequency, an internal pressure that gently disrupts your usual way of organizing reality. Thoughts that once felt solid lose weight. Certainties you relied on start to wobble. You may notice that your attention no longer settles where it used to. The things that once absorbed you now feel oddly flat, while other thoughts, images, or long-forgotten ideas suddenly feel charged, almost magnetic. This is not randomness. The emerald signal doesn't add anything new to you. It reorders what is already there. Like a tuning fork placed near an instrument, it brings certain inner strings into resonance and leaves others silent. That's why it feels intimate, even personal. Two people can live through the same week, the same news cycle, the same routines, and only one of them feels this internal rearrangement. The signal doesn't move through crowds. It moves through readiness, even when you don't consciously feel ready at all. As it activates, perception subtly shifts. You start noticing patterns where before you saw coincidence, not in a mystical, exaggerated way, but in a grounded, almost uncomfortable way. Conversations repeat the same themes. Books open to pages that echo your private questions. Old memories surface without warning, not to trap you in the past, but to show you unfinished threads. It can feel unsettling because the mind prefers stability, and this frequency is not interested in keeping things stable. It is interested in coherence. One of the first things people misunderstand about this activation is assuming it should feel peaceful. Often it doesn't. The emerald signal exposes misalignment, and exposure rarely feels calm at first. If you've been living slightly off-center from what you know is true, the signal doesn't correct you gently. It applies pressure. That pressure shows up as restlessness, a sense that something needs to change even if you don't know what. You might feel pulled toward decisions you had postponed for years, while the reasons you used to delay them suddenly sound hollow. What's actually happening is that your internal hierarchy is being reorganized. For a long time, logic, habit, and external expectation may have been running the show. The emerald signal doesn't attack those systems directly. It simply reduces their authority. In that vacuum, something older and more precise begins to surface. Not a thought, not a plan, a movement, an inner leaning that doesn't ask permission from reason before it acts. This is why the activation feels confusing. The mind wants a narrative, a cause and effect explanation. The signal offers none. It bypasses explanation and goes straight to orientation. You don't suddenly know more. You suddenly want differently. And that shift can feel threatening, because wanting differently implies living differently, and living differently implies loss. Loss of familiar roles, loss of predictable outcomes, loss of the comfort that comes from knowing who you are supposed to be. The emerald signal doesn't care about those losses. It is not cruel, but it is indifferent to comfort. Its function is alignment, not reassurance. When it activates, it doesn't ask you to believe anything new. It asks you to notice what no longer fits, that noticing alone starts a chain reaction. Once seen, misalignment cannot be unseen. You can ignore it for a while, distract yourself, explain it away. But the internal pressure remains, quietly building. At this stage, many people think they are losing control. In reality, control was never where the real movement came from. The signal reveals that much of what you called choice was repetition, and much of what you called discipline was avoidance. As the frequency stabilizes, something surprising happens. Decisions start forming before justifications. You feel drawn toward an action before you can explain why it matters. The mind scrambles to catch up, to label it as impulsive or irresponsible, but the pull remains. This is the threshold most people misunderstand. They assume the next step should be to think harder, plan better, discipline themselves more. But the emerald signal doesn't awaken the intellect first. It awakens desire. Not desire as craving or fantasy, but desire as direction. A directional force that moves ahead of logic, setting the path before the map exists. If you're paying attention, you may already feel it. A quiet urgency. Not panic, not excitement, but a sense that something inside you has begun walking, even if the rest of you is still standing still. And once desire begins to move, the old order can't be restored. The question is no longer whether something is happening. The question is whether you will recognize that desire is not a distraction from the path, but the first signal that the path has already opened. Before thought forms a sentence, something in you has already leaned forward. This is the part most people were never taught to trust. We were trained to believe that reason leads and desire follows, that logic lights the way and emotion reacts. But when the emerald signal is active, that order quietly reverses. Desire moves first. Thought arrives later, often out of breath, trying to explain a decision that has already begun to take shape. This kind of desire doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't shout or demand. It appears as a pull, a subtle gravity towards certain ideas, places, conversations, or choices. You may notice yourself thinking about the same thing repeatedly without forcing it, not obsessively, but persistently. It returns in the quiet moments, in the spaces between tasks, in the pause before sleep. That repetition is not a flaw in your focus. It's direction asserting itself. Reason, by contrast, is slow and conservative. Its job is to protect what already exists. It scans for risk, compares outcomes, and relies on past experience to predict the future. That's useful for maintaining stability, but it's terrible at initiating change. Desire is different. Desire is the body's intelligence recognizing a future before the mind can imagine it. It senses coherence ahead of proof. This is why desire often feels inconvenient. It doesn't arrive when life is neatly arranged. It interrupts routines that were functioning well enough. It asks questions reason would rather postpone. When desire activates first, the mind often labels it as irrational, premature, or dangerous, but those labels are defenses. They protect the current structure, not your deeper alignment. You've likely experienced this before, long before you had language for it, a moment when you felt compelled to speak, to leave, to begin, to stop, without a clear explanation. Later, sometimes much later, the logic revealed itself. The mistake we make is judging desire by the standards of logic, instead of recognizing that they operate on different timelines. Desire works in advance. Logic works in review. When the emerald signal intensifies, this sequence becomes more obvious. You act or want to act, and only afterward do the reasons begin to assemble. This can feel destabilizing, especially if you were taught that a good decision must be fully understood before it's taken. But understanding has never been the source of movement. It's the story we tell ourselves after movement has already started. There's a deeper layer here that most people miss. This desire is not personal in the way ego desires are. It's not about proving something, accumulating more, or filling a void. In fact, it often pulls you away from validation. It may guide you toward quieter choices, simpler paths, or decisions that don't look impressive from the outside. That's because this desire isn't trying to make you bigger. It's trying to make you truer. Reason struggles with that. The mind prefers desires that can be justified socially, financially or morally. It wants guarantees, but the kind of desire that moves first offers none. It asks for motion without certainty. That's why so many people freeze at this stage. They wait for clarity, not realizing that clarity is the result of movement, not the condition for it. If you resist this pull long enough, something else happens. Desire doesn't disappear, it distorts. It leaks into anxiety, distraction, irritability, or a vague dissatisfaction that has no obvious cause. The energy that wanted to move still wants to move. When it's blocked, it expresses itself sideways. This is why people feel restless, even when their lives look fine. The problem isn't lack of discipline, it's suppressed direction. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Desire is already shaping your decisions, whether you admit it or not. The difference is whether it does so consciously or unconsciously. When ignored, it drives you from the shadows, influencing choices you later rationalize as accidents or obligations. When acknowledged, it becomes clean, direct, less dramatic, not more. The mind fears that trusting desire will lead to chaos, but chaos usually comes from conflict, not movement. Conflict between what you feel drawn toward and what you allow yourself to admit. When those two align, something stabilizes, not immediately, but perceptibly. You begin to sense which desires carry weight and which are just noise. That discernment doesn't come from thinking harder. It comes from paying attention to how your body responds before your thoughts intervene. You may notice that some desires exhaust you just by imagining them, while others energize you even when they seem difficult. That difference matters. Desire that moves first carries energy with it. It doesn't drain you, it organizes you. And once you start noticing that distinction, you can no longer pretend all wants are equal. This is the threshold where many people make a critical mistake. They try to bring desire back under control, to discipline it, manage it, tame it. That impulse feels responsible, even mature. But it misunderstands the nature of what's happening. You're not dealing with a problem to be solved. You're encountering a force that doesn't respond to force. And as soon as the urge to control desire appears, another question quietly forms beneath it, waiting for attention. What happens when discipline tries to lead something that was never meant to follow? When desire starts to move, the reflex to control it appears almost instantly. It's subtle, often disguised as responsibility or maturity. You tell yourself you're being careful, grounded, realistic. You reach for discipline the way you were taught to, as a tool to restrain, to regulate, to keep things from getting out of hand. On the surface, this looks wise. Beneath it, something else is happening. Discipline was never designed to lead desire. Its role was to support direction, not to replace it. But most people were taught the opposite. They were taught that desire is wild, unreliable, even dangerous, and that order must be imposed from above. So when desire rises with unexpected force, the first impulse is to clamp down, to contain it before it disrupts the life you've carefully arranged. The problem is that desire doesn't respond to pressure the way habits do. You can discipline a routine, you can discipline a schedule, you can even discipline certain behaviors. But desire operates at a different depth. When you try to control it, it doesn't submit. It goes underground. And what goes underground doesn't disappear. It mutates. This is where confusion begins. You may notice yourself becoming more rigid, more tired, more self-critical. You push yourself harder, convinced that if you just apply enough structure, the internal tension will resolve. But the tension isn't coming from a lack of discipline. It's coming from a misalignment between movement and restraint. You're using the wrong tool for the wrong task. Ancient traditions hinted at this, though the language was different. They understood that desire is closer to fire than to water. Fire can't be extinguished by adding fuel, but it also can't be extinguished by denial alone. Smothering it creates smoke. Uncontrolled, it burns everything. The skill was never about suppression. It was about orientation. Modern culture lost that distinction. Discipline became a moral badge, a sign of worth. Desire became suspect, something to be justified or tamed. So when the emerald signal activates and desire moves first, many people panic internally. They mistake intensity for danger. They assume that if they don't rein it in immediately, something will go wrong. What actually goes wrong is the act of reining it in. The moment discipline tries to dominate desire, an internal split forms. One part of you moves forward, another part pulls back. Energy that could have gone into clarity is diverted into inner conflict. You start negotiating with yourself, setting conditions, making promises you don't intend to keep. Later, when things calm down, after I'm more prepared. Each delay feels reasonable. Together they create stagnation. The body registers this conflict long before the mind admits it. Tightness increases. Breathing becomes shallow. Sleep becomes restless. You may feel productive on the outside while feeling strangely hollow inside. Discipline keeps the machine running, but something essential is missing. The sense of direction fades, replaced by effort without meaning. This is why discipline alone eventually leads to burnout. Not because discipline is bad, but because it was never meant to generate purpose. It can maintain a path. It cannot choose one. When you ask it to do so, it becomes punitive instead of supportive. You start using it against yourself, measuring worth by compliance rather than coherence. There's another mistake hidden inside this one. When people try to control desire, they often confuse fear with wisdom. The fear says, "This could cost you something." Wisdom asks, "What is it already costing you to resist?" Discipline listens to fear easily because fear offers clear boundaries. Desire does not. It offers movement without guarantees. This is especially uncomfortable for those who pride themselves on self-control. Letting desire lead feels like regression, like losing something hard-earned. But control is not the same as agency. Agency comes from alignment, not restraint. When desire and discipline work together, discipline follows the lead of desire, shaping it into sustainable action. When discipline leads, desire either rebels or withers. If you look closely, you'll notice that the desires people try hardest to control are often the ones that point toward a deeper change. Surface cravings don't scare us as much. We can dismiss them easily. But desires that threaten identity, roles, or long-standing commitments trigger immediate resistance. Discipline rushes in, not to help, but to protect the status quo. The tragedy is that many people interpret the resulting discomfort as proof that desire was wrong. "See," they tell themselves, "this is why I can't trust it." But the discomfort wasn't caused by desire. It was caused by the attempt to dominate it. Like forcing a river into a narrow channel, the pressure builds until something gives. At this stage, a quieter realization begins to form, often ignored at first. The question shifts from "how do I control this?" to "what if control isn't the point?" That question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It simply loosens the grip. And in that looseness, something becomes visible. The sense that you're standing at a crossroads you didn't know existed, where continuing as before requires just as much courage as changing course. Most crossroads don't look like intersections. There's no sign, no clear split in the road, no moment where life pauses and asks you to choose. The energetic crossroads you're standing in now is quieter than that. It feels like continuation, like nothing has really changed. And that's exactly why so many people pass through it, without realizing it was there at all. An energetic crossroads isn't about two visible options, it's about two internal directions. One continues the familiar momentum, the patterns that have carried you this far. The other doesn't present a clear picture yet. It only shows up as tension, as a subtle sense that the way you've been moving no longer fits the weight you're carrying inside. You can't fully articulate it, but you feel it when you slow down enough to notice. This is why it's easy to miss. From the outside, your life may look stable. Responsibilities are being met. Routines are functioning. Nothing is obviously broken. But internally, something has shifted. The old motivations don't generate the same energy. The rewards you use to work toward feel strangely distant, as if they belong to a different version of you. You tell yourself you're just tired, or going through a phase, but phases pass. This feels different, it lingers. At an energetic crossroads, the past and the future pull on you at the same time. The past pulls with familiarity, with known costs and predictable outcomes. The future pulls without images, without promises. It doesn't offer reassurance, it offers direction without detail. and the mind, trained to choose based on evidence, naturally sides with the past. At least the past can be explained. What makes this moment critical is that not choosing is also a choice. Energy doesn't stay neutral. When desire has begun to move and discipline has failed to suppress it, something must resolve. Either the structure of your life adapts to the new direction, or the new direction gets buried under structure. Both paths require energy. One leads to alignment, the other leads to fragmentation. You might notice this fragmentation in small ways. You say yes when you mean no. You feel irritation at things that never bothered you before. You start fantasizing about escape, not because you want to leave everything behind, but because staying exactly as you are feels heavier each day. These are not signs of weakness. They are signals of pressure building at the intersection. The word energetic matters here. This is not a philosophical dilemma. It's not about values on paper or hypothetical futures. It's about how energy moves through you. When you imagine continuing as you are for the next few years, does something in you tighten or go dull? When you imagine stepping toward what you're drawn to, even without knowing the outcome, does something subtly open? These reactions happen before thought. They're data, not drama. Most people ignore this data because it doesn't fit into spreadsheets or conversations. It can't be easily explained to others, and often not even to yourself. So you default to momentum. You keep going because stopping would require admitting that something fundamental has changed, and that admission feels risky. It threatens identities built over decades. But the crossroads doesn't disappear when ignored. It becomes louder in indirect ways. Your tolerance for inauthentic situations drops. Your patience thins. You begin to feel out of place in rooms where you once felt competent. None of this means you're failing. It means the internal map you've been using no longer matches the terrain you're walking. Here's the part almost no one tells you. You don't feel ready at an energetic crossroads. Readiness is a myth created by the mind to delay movement. If you felt fully prepared, this wouldn't be a crossroads. It would be a scheduled transition. Crossroads are defined by ambiguity. They demand response before certainty. This is where people start searching for signs, confirmations, permissions. They wait for clarity to arrive from the outside, but clarity at this stage doesn't come as information. It comes as relief or resistance when you consider moving in one direction or the other. The body knows before the story does. Ignoring this moment doesn't keep things neutral. It slowly drains vitality. Life becomes something you manage rather than participate in. You do the right things, say the right words, and still feel oddly disconnected, as if you're watching yourself from a distance. That distance is the cost of postponement. The emerald signal didn't activate to make you uncomfortable for no reason. It activated to bring you to this intersection where continuation and coherence diverge. You may not see two roads, but you can feel the difference between drifting and choosing. And as this pressure builds, it starts to show up not just in your thoughts, but in your nervous system, in your sleep, in your moods, creating symptoms that seem unrelated at first, but are anything but. When the internal shift begins, the body is often the first to speak. Not in clear sentences, but in sensations that are easy to misinterpret. Anxiety appears without an obvious trigger. Sleep becomes lighter, fragmented, or elusive. Thoughts scatter, then loop, then dissolve into a vague sense of mental fog. Most people assume something is wrong with them. They search for fixes, labels, explanations. But what if these experiences are not malfunctions and not warnings of collapse, but signs of reorganization? Anxiety in this context is not fear of something specific. It's energy without a clear outlet. When desire starts moving and the old structures resist, that energy has nowhere to go. It circulates instead. The nervous system reads this circulation as alertness without resolution. Your body stays on standby, as if waiting for a signal that never quite arrives. You may feel tense even during calm moments, uneasy without knowing why. This isn't weakness, it's momentum meeting obstruction. Insomnia follows a similar pattern. Sleep requires a sense of safety and completion, a feeling that the day has settled. But when your internal direction is unresolved, nothing fully settles. Even when you're exhausted, something inside you remains awake, attentive, listening. You may wake in the early hours with a mind that's strangely clear and restless at the same time, not racing with obvious worries, but alert, as if there's something important you're supposed to remember. Confusion often completes the trio. It shows up as difficulty making decisions that used to be easy. You second-guess yourself. You feel torn between options that all seem inadequate. This confusion isn't a lack of intelligence or focus. It's the mind trying to operate with an outdated map. The internal landscape has changed, but the mental tools you're using belong to a previous version of you. Of course, things feel unclear. You're navigating new terrain with old coordinates. What makes these symptoms so unsettling is that they don't follow a linear logic. They come and go. One day you feel sharp and calm, the next day restless and scattered. This inconsistency leads people to doubt themselves. If this were real, they think, wouldn't it be clearer? But transformation rarely announces itself with consistency. It arrives in waves, testing the system, pulling back, then pressing again. There's also a deeper layer to this discomfort. As the emerald signal reorganizes perception, the stories you've been telling yourself for years begin to loosen. Stories about who you are, what you want, what you're capable of. When those stories weaken, even temporarily, the ego experiences it as disorientation. The mind likes continuity. When continuity is interrupted, it sounds an alarm. Anxiety is often that alarm. Many people try to quiet these symptoms by returning to old coping strategies. More control, more distraction, more productivity. They fill their schedules, numb themselves with noise, or double down on routines that once worked. These strategies may reduce the intensity for a while, but they don't resolve the underlying tension. They treat the signal as a problem to be silenced rather than information to be understood. There's a crucial distinction here. Pathological anxiety narrows your world. This kind of activation-related anxiety widens it, even if that widening feels overwhelming at first. You become more sensitive, not less. More aware of inconsistencies, of misalignment, of emotional undercurrents you once ignored. The cost of this awareness is temporary discomfort. The benefit is accuracy. Sleep disturbance follows the same logic. The nights feel longer because something in you is recalibrating. The subconscious is busy integrating material that was previously suppressed or ignored. Dreams may become vivid or strange, or you may feel as though you're thinking even while asleep. This isn't your mind breaking down. It's your mind working overtime to catch up with a shift that didn't ask for its permission. Confusion, too, has a function. It slows impulsive decisions based on outdated motivations. It creates a pause, a gap where observation can begin. Without confusion, you might rush to resolve the tension in familiar ways, locking yourself back into patterns that no longer fit. Confusion keeps you open, even when openness feels uncomfortable. The danger is mislabeling these symptoms as purely negative. When that happens, you fight them, suppress them, or judge yourself for having them. That judgment adds another layer of tension. The nervous system tightens further. What began as a signal becomes a struggle, if instead you allow for the possibility that these experiences are messages rather than mistakes. Your relationship to them changes. You stop asking, "How do I get rid of this?" and start asking, "What is this responding to?" That question doesn't demand immediate answers. It invites observation. And observation is not passive, it's an active stance. While reaction keeps you trapped inside the symptoms, observation creates a slight distance. In that distance, you begin to notice how quickly emotions arise, how thoughts latch onto them, how narratives form almost automatically. You start to see the machinery of your inner world at work. This is the point where another shift becomes possible. If you continue reacting, you remain programmable, shaped by every emotional spike and mental loop. But if you learn to observe without immediately intervening, you step outside the automatic patterns that have been running you for years, and that's when the real reprogramming of reality quietly begins. Something is being rewritten, but not in the way most people imagine. There is no external reset, no sudden collapse you can point to on a calendar. The reprogramming happens quietly, through repetition, emotion, and attention. Reality doesn't change first. The way you relate to it does. And that shift, almost invisible at the start, determines what you experience as possible or impossible in the months ahead. Every moment you react without noticing, a pattern strengthens. A thought appears, an emotion follows, a behavior locks in. Over time, this loop becomes automatic. You stop choosing it and start living inside it. This is how reality programs itself through you, not by force but by familiarity. The emerald signal disrupts this familiarity. It creates just enough friction for you to notice the loop while it's running. This is why becoming an observer matters now, not later. Observation interrupts automation. The moment you see a reaction forming without immediately obeying it, something fundamental changes. You step out of the program and into awareness of it. That awareness doesn't need to be dramatic or spiritual. It's simple, even mundane. You notice how quickly your mind labels an experience as good or bad. You notice how certain emotions trigger predictable stories. You notice how the body tightens or leans forward before a thought finishes. Most people think observation means detachment or distance. It doesn't. It means intimacy without entanglement. You're close enough to feel what's happening, but not so close that you're pulled into acting it out automatically. This position is subtle and, at first, uncomfortable. The mind wants resolution. It wants to act, decide, fix. Observation delays that impulse just long enough for a different response to become possible. The hidden reprogramming works both ways. If you remain reactive, the environment, the media you consume, the emotional tone of others, all shape your inner world without your consent. You absorb their urgency, their fears, their priorities. You call it the way things are. But when you observe, you begin to see how much of what you feel isn't actually yours. It's borrowed, absorbed, repeated. This is especially important now because emotional intensity is increasing everywhere. Faster information, sharper opinions, constant stimulation. The nervous system is being trained to respond quickly and often. Reaction becomes a habit. Observation becomes rare. In that landscape, whoever controls attention controls experience. Not in a conspiratorial sense, but in a psychological one. Attention is the gateway through which reality enters you. When you observe, you reclaim that gateway. You notice how certain headlines spike your body before you finish reading. You notice how certain conversations leave you drained or agitated. You notice how your mood shifts after scrolling, watching, listening. None of this requires judgment. It requires noticing, and noticing creates choice. At first, observation feels like standing still while everything else moves. You may feel slower, less decisive. That's temporary. What's actually happening is recalibration. You're learning the difference between impulse and signal, between conditioned reaction and authentic movement. Without this pause, desire itself gets hijacked by external noise. You think you want something, but what you really want is relief from stimulation. The emerald signal amplifies this distinction. It sharpens sensitivity. You feel the cost of unconscious reactions more clearly. A single argument can linger for hours. A careless decision echoes longer than before. This isn't punishment, it's feedback. The system is becoming more responsive, more precise. In such a system, observation isn't optional, it's protective. There's another layer to this reprogramming that's easy to miss. As you observe, the stories you've been telling yourself start to lose authority. Not because you argue with them, but because you see them forming. You notice how quickly you move into roles: the responsible one, the victim, the fixer, the skeptic. These roles once helped you survive. Now they limit perception. Observation doesn't destroy them. It loosens their grip. This loosening can feel like emptiness at first. If you're not immediately reacting, who are you? If you're not following familiar scripts, what guides you? This is where many people retreat back into old patterns. The unknown feels too exposed, but if you stay with the observation, something else begins to emerge. A quieter clarity, a sense of timing. You start to feel when action is aligned and when it's just noise demanding release. Observation doesn't make you passive, it makes your actions cleaner, fewer, but more precise. Instead of reacting to everything, you respond to what matters. Instead of being pulled in 10 directions, you feel drawn in one. This is how reality begins to reorganize around you, not because you force it to, but because your participation changes. And yet, observation alone is not the end of the process. It's a threshold, a way of seeing clearly enough to recognize another trap that waits just ahead, the belief that there will be a perfect moment to act, a time when uncertainty dissolves and movement becomes safe. That belief feels reasonable. It sounds patient. But in a system that responds to motion, waiting carries a cost you may not have calculated yet. Waiting feels responsible. It sounds like patience, wisdom, maturity. You tell yourself you're not avoiding action. You're just being careful. You're gathering information, watching how things unfold, giving yourself time. On the surface, this makes sense. But beneath it, another pattern is at work, one that quietly keeps you frozen while life continues to move without you. The idea of a right moment belongs to a linear view of time, a belief that life unfolds in a clean sequence. Prepare, then act. Understand, then move. Feel ready, then decide. But when the emerald signal is active, time no longer behaves that way. Cause and effect blur. Decisions don't wait for certainty. They generate it. Movement doesn't follow clarity. It creates it. This is why waiting now feels different than it used to. It's not restful, it's tense. You're not pausing to integrate, you're holding your breath. The body knows this before the mind admits it. There's a subtle contraction, a sense of being slightly behind, even when nothing obvious is wrong. That's the cost of waiting in a system that responds to motion, not intention. The trap is subtle because waiting offers relief. It postpones risk. It delays the discomfort of stepping into the unknown, and it gives the mind something to do. Analyze, compare, plan. Activity without commitment feels productive, but internally energy stagnates. Desire, which was meant to move first, starts circling instead. What began as direction turns into restlessness. Linear time suggests that if you wait long enough, conditions will improve, that the fog will lift on its own, that the fear will fade. But fear doesn't fade through waiting. It fades through contact. Clarity doesn't arrive by standing still. It arrives by engaging with reality and letting reality respond. Without that feedback, the mind fills the gap with speculation. This is why people often feel more confused the longer they wait. They assume waiting will simplify things, but it multiplies possibilities instead. Every unchosen option remains open, demanding attention. The mental load increases. The sense of self fragments. You begin to doubt your instincts, not because they're wrong, but because you've trained yourself not to trust them. There's also a quiet grief hidden in waiting. Each delayed action subtly reinforces the belief that you're not ready yet, that something essential is missing. Over time, that belief hardens into identity. You become someone who is almost there, always preparing, always on the verge. It feels safe, but it's deeply unsatisfying. When linear time dissolves, the question shifts. It's no longer, is this the right moment? But is this the direction? Direction doesn't require perfect timing. It requires responsiveness. You move, reality responds, you adjust. This is how coherence is built. Not in one leap, but through a series of small lived confirmations. The body understands this intuitively. Notice how relief often comes not after a perfect decision, but after a decision is made at all. Even when the outcome is uncertain, something settles once movement begins. That settling isn't proof of success. It's proof of alignment. You're back in dialogue with life, instead of watching it from the sidelines. Waiting breaks that dialogue. It turns life into a spectator sport. You observe, you think, you comment internally, but you don't participate. Over time, this creates a sense of unreality, as if you're slightly removed from your own experience. Days pass quickly, but feel empty. Weeks blur together. You're busy, but not engaged. The emerald signal doesn't operate on deadlines, but it does respond to motion. It amplifies whatever you feed it. If you feed it hesitation, it magnifies uncertainty. If you feed it action, even imperfect action, it begins to organize circumstances around that movement. This isn't magic, it's feedback loops. Engagement sharpens perception. Perception refines choice. Many people tell themselves they're waiting for confidence. But confidence is not a prerequisite. It's a byproduct. It emerges after you survive your own movement, after you realize that uncertainty didn't destroy you. Each step builds evidence, not in the abstract, but in the body. The hardest part is letting go of the fantasy that there will be a moment without risk. That moment doesn't exist. There is only now, with its incomplete information and uneven ground. Linear time promised safety through delay. But in a non-linear reality, delay is just another form of movement, one that carries you further from coherence. As this becomes clearer, another realization begins to surface, one that challenges everything you were taught about desire. If movement creates clarity and waiting distorts it, then perhaps desire itself is not the problem. Perhaps the real danger lies in misreading desire as chaos, when it may be the only compass left that still points home. For a long time, desire was framed as something dangerous, unstable, a force that, if followed, would scatter your life in 100 directions. You were taught that structure keeps you safe and that desire, left unchecked, leads to chaos. What was never explained is that this only applies to unaligned desire, the kind that tries to fill emptiness, escape discomfort, or prove worth. Aligned desire behaves very differently. Aligned desire is quiet. It doesn't shout or rush. It doesn't demand immediate gratification. It persists. It returns when distractions fade. It remains even when you talk yourself out of it. This persistence is often mistaken for obsession or restlessness, but it's neither. It's orientation. A steady inner pull toward coherence. Chaos doesn't come from following desire. It comes from following many conflicting desires at once, or from following desires that were never truly yours to begin with. Much of what people call desire is actually conditioning. Expectations absorbed from family, culture, fear, or comparison. Those wants feel urgent but hollow. They spike and fade. Aligned desire, by contrast, deepens over time. The more you ignore it, the heavier it feels. This is why aligned desire often points you towards simplicity rather than excess. It may guide you away from certain ambitions, relationships, or identities that no longer fit. From the outside, this can look like loss. From the inside, it feels like relief mixed with fear. Relief because something false is loosening. Fear because the false was familiar. Aligned desire doesn't promise ease, it promises integrity. When you follow it, life may not get immediately smoother, but it gets clearer. Choices start making sense in the body before they make sense in the mind. You notice that certain actions, even difficult ones, leave you feeling more settled afterward. Other actions, even comfortable ones, leave you drained. This contrast becomes your compass. One of the reasons this truth was never emphasized is that aligned desire can't be standardized. There's no formula, no checklist. It doesn't respond to rules. It requires attention, presence, the willingness to feel into decisions rather than just think them through. That's inconvenient in a culture that values speed and certainty. Aligned desire also asks you to release a particular illusion, that your life needs to look a certain way to be valid. When desire is aligned, it's not concerned with appearances, it's concerned with fit. It asks, does this match who you are becoming? Not how will this be perceived? That question can feel destabilizing if much of your identity was built around external validation. Another misconception is that following aligned desire means acting on every impulse. It doesn't. Impulses are noisy. They fluctuate with mood, fatigue, and stimulation. Aligned desire has a different texture. It feels grounded, even when it's uncomfortable. There's a sense of rightness that doesn't depend on excitement. You may feel nervous but not scattered, challenged but not torn. As you learn to recognize this difference, trust builds naturally. Not blind trust, but experiential trust. You begin to see that when you honor aligned desire, even in small ways, life responds. Conversations open, resources appear. Not magically, but causally. You're moving in sync with your own energy, and that coherence ripples outward. This is what it means to be guided home. Not to a place, but to a state of internal congruence, a feeling of being where you are, doing what you're doing, without the constant background noise of self-betrayal. Home is not comfort, it's alignment. And alignment has a stabilizing effect. It reduces unnecessary friction. It clarifies priorities. It simplifies decisions. People fear that if they follow desire, they'll lose control. What actually happens is that control becomes unnecessary. You're no longer forcing yourself forward or holding yourself back. You're responding, adjusting, listening. Life becomes less about managing and more about participating. This doesn't mean everything falls into place effortlessly. Challenges remain, uncertainty remains. But the challenges feel relevant. They belong to the path you're on, not to a detour you're maintaining out of fear. There's a difference between difficulty that sharpens you and difficulty that drains you. Aligned desire leads to the former. As this understanding deepens, another realization emerges, one that can be uncomfortable to face. The pull you're feeling now didn't suddenly appear. It didn't arrive because something external changed. It's been there for a long time, quietly signaling, adjusting its volume as needed. And the only reason it feels urgent now is not because it's new, but because something else has run out. Your ability to ignore it without consequence. There is a moment when realization stops being exciting and starts being honest. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just clear. The realization is this: nothing truly new has arrived. The signal you're feeling now didn't appear out of nowhere. It has been with you for a long time, patient, quiet, adjusting itself to how much you were willing to notice. You sensed it years ago in fleeting ways. In that thought you pushed aside because it felt impractical. In that pull you explained away because it didn't fit the timing. In that inner resistance you felt when you said yes, but meant no. Each time the signal showed up softly without urgency. And each time it was easier to look away than to question the life you were already living. Looking away wasn't a failure. It was a strategy. You had reasons, responsibilities, roles to uphold, paths you had committed to before you knew yourself this well. Ignoring the signal allowed you to function, to build, to survive. It kept things predictable. And for a long time that was enough. What changed is not the signal. What changed is the cost of ignoring it. At first, ignoring felt neutral. Then it felt uncomfortable. Then it began to feel heavy. Not in one dramatic moment, but gradually, like carrying a weight you once thought was normal. The body adapted. The mind rationalized. This is just how life is. But something in you knew that wasn't true. You just didn't want to know what acknowledging it would require. This is the uncomfortable part. Seeing the signal now means admitting that many of your delays weren't about timing or readiness. They were about fear. Fear of disruption. Fear of disappointing others. Fear of stepping into a version of yourself you couldn't yet picture. And fear is persuasive. It sounds like reason. It wears the mask of caution. So you waited. You managed. You adjusted around the signal instead of toward it. You made compromises that seemed small at the time, each one justified on its own. But compromises accumulate. They shape identity. Over time, you start to believe you are the version of yourself that made them. The emerald signal never argued with you. It never punished you. It simply kept pulsing, matching your capacity to hear it. When you were busy, it whispered. When you were overwhelmed, it softened. When you were distracted, it waited. That patience is what makes this moment so sharp. The signal didn't force itself on you. It let you arrive here on your own. Now, noticing it brings a mix of emotions. Relief, because something finally makes sense. Regret, because you can see the moments you turned away. Grief, because certain paths are no longer available. This mix can be heavy, and many people try to avoid it by reframing the past or blaming circumstances. But this isn't about blame. It's about accuracy. Accuracy requires acknowledging that you knew more than you allowed yourself to admit. This doesn't mean you should have acted sooner. It means you are able to act now. The signal respects timing, even when it challenges excuses. You couldn't see clearly before because seeing clearly would have demanded movement you weren't ready to make. Now the readiness is not emotional comfort. It's necessity. The old strategies no longer work. The distractions no longer satisfy. The compromises no longer hold. This is why the signal feels louder now, not because it's shouting, but because everything else has gone quiet. The noise of justification, of busyness, of postponement has thinned. What remains is a simple, persistent knowing. Not about every detail, just about direction. Many people mistake this moment for crisis. They think something is wrong because the old answers don't land anymore. But this is not collapse, it's exposure. You're seeing yourself without the filters that once kept things manageable. That exposure is uncomfortable, but it's also clean. There's less self-deception available. You may notice a new honesty emerging in small ways. You're less willing to pretend interest, less able to tolerate misalignment, less patient with narratives that keep you small. This isn't bitterness, it's clarity, and clarity has a way of stripping away excuses without replacing them with comforting alternatives. The signal has always been about this moment of recognition, not to shame you for the past, but to free you from repeating it. Seeing it now doesn't demand that you fix everything or rewrite your life overnight. It asks for something simpler and more difficult at the same time, that you stop pretending you don't know. From here on, pretending becomes expensive. Every choice carries feedback. Every delay registers. The signal doesn't threaten you with consequences. It simply removes the buffer that once softened them. You feel more because you are more present, and presence changes the equation. When you are present, movement is no longer theoretical. It becomes immediate, physical, real. The signal responds to that kind of engagement. Not to intentions, not to plans, to motion. What happens next doesn't depend on your confidence or your certainty. It depends on whether you're willing to act without hiding behind the idea that someday later you'll be ready. The moment has arrived, not because everything is clear, but because it never will be in the way you were waiting for. The emerald signal does not respond to certainty, confidence, or perfect plans. It responds to movement, even small movement, especially honest movement. You don't need to know the whole path. You don't need to feel fearless. You only need to stop standing still, while something inside you is already walking. Action is not the reward at the end of understanding. Action is what brings understanding into focus. When you move, reality answers. When you hesitate, it stays silent. If this reached you, it's because you felt it somewhere beyond words. That quiet recognition matters. To mark that you were here until the end, write this exact sentence in the comments. I felt the emerald signal move. And if this resonated, choose one of the videos on your screen now, watch it, stay in the movement. If you want more like this, that next step is already waiting.